Today, our seminar, Turkish economy after election, it's very important to learn more about it, details and developments last 10-15 years. We have already looked at the document produced together with Özlem and he's a senior lecturer at Greenwich University, and as I said, his work very interesting, and the facts and figures are very important. I think he is going to give more details and the evidence about Turkish economy, what's going on. So let me listen to you.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. So the speech that I will make today is basically based on few papers, mainly our paper with Özlem Onaran, but I've taken some figures from the work that I'm doing with two other colleagues of mine, and I added some new data to discuss the topic, because the work with Özlem Onaran was published in 2016, and there are new developments in Turkey. I divided the talk into three parts. One is what is Turkey's growth regime? I mean, what's the structure of Turkey's growth regime? And I'll talk a bit about the regular boom and bust cycles in Turkey. And second part is more like on the inequalities in Turkey and how the inequalities in Turkey are being affected while there's economic growth happening. And third part will be a vague discussion on policy alternatives, but I will try to support that discussion with some facts too. So I'll start with speculation-led growth regime, what I say. Starting from 1980s, there's a neoliberal shift from the import substitute industrialization strategy to more export-oriented growth model, and this is followed by the capital account liberalization that's brought by Turgut Özal. And following this, Turkey experienced two economic crises that's pushed by capital outflows. One is the 1994 Tansu-Çiller crisis and the 2001 Ecevit crisis. And following the Ecevit crisis, the Justice and Development Party, AKP, got elected in 2002, as you all know. Well, the first period of AKP government was subject to, AKP government came by the end of 2002, but it was subject to very high economic growth, around like 7.8% economic growth during the years 2002 and 2006. And this growth was prompted by Turkey's EU candidacy. Of course, there's a recovery of the economic crisis from 2001. There were capital inflows and also FDIs, foreign direct investments, that were led by privatizations too. But this growth was quite vulnerable in the sense that there was a massive current account deficit. So our imports were much bigger than our exports, and this was basically closed mainly by financial flows coming from abroad. Because when you basically spend more than you're producing, what do you have to do? You either take loans, you have to sell some of your financial assets or some of your real assets, like you have to find money from somewhere. So Turkey in that period became one of the most vulnerable economies with an extreme exchange rate overvaluation, high external financing needs, and massive dependence on capital flow. So this growth was happening with very much high dependence on capital flow. And of course this was also supported by relatively low interest rates in 2000s. That also supported the growth of low interest rates in the developed world, I would say. That also supported the growth in the other developing economies too. However, in 2008, once the American economy went into a crisis which led to this global Great Recession, Turkey got affected massively from this. And Tayyip Erdogan was saying, well, the growth, the crisis will pass at a tangent to Turkey, but it wasn't the case actually. There was a small growth rate in 2008 and a contraction of 4.7 in 2009, which was much deeper than the other major emerging economies like Argentina, Brazil, South Korea and Thailand. So as an economy, Turkey was much more highly dependent on capital inflows than other countries. So once the capital inflows stopped, the economy was affected worse. And when you look at the growth in GDP per capita, this is not GDP, in different country groups, we can have an idea about the structure of the Turkish economy. The 90s, as you can see, during the 90s, Turkey was more like a lower middle income country, then it moved to the group of upper middle income country. And the growth rates in GDP per capita was low compared to 2000s, compared to the Erdogan period. But it was the case for all of the emerging economies. And we grouped as countries that are not full dependent. Well, a similar structure can be seen in 1990s. So we were like experiencing hyperinflation in 90s, which was the case in Latin American countries. So similar problems, economic crises were happening in those countries too. Whereas in the next period, there's a growth, as you can see, in middle-income countries, which is also happening in Turkey, in terms of GDP per capita. So Turkey is basically following global trends in that sense. If you look at the structure of the Turkish economy, you can see that compared to lower middle and upper middle income periods, during the period of global crisis, Turkey contracted much more. The GDP per capita in Turkey contracted much more than other middle-income countries. And during the periods of boom, Turkey has been growing higher than other middle-income countries. So Turkey has less smooth business cycles, and with like really good growth rates at the times of boom and big contractions at the times of bust. And the reason behind that can be basically, if you look, for instance, or maybe first let me just talk a bit about why there was contraction massively in 2008. Well, there was a massive gap between savings and investment ratios in the private sector. So there was the domestic credits taken by the private sector was very dependent on the foreign finance, since there wasn't enough savings in Turkey. And of course, when there is like high volatility in capital inflows, which affected Turkish economy, the private sector also realized the uncertainties and they stopped investing because there was a significant decline in the real sector confidence index. So there was decline in the confidence in the private sector on the economy, which basically led to decline in investments, gross capital formation, by 20% in 2009. There was a decline in export revenues, but a decline in import revenues. So, but mainly the contraction was led by this, which is due to two reasons. I mean, awareness of fragilities in Turkey by private sector and need for foreign capital, which wasn't available at the time of recession. And when you look at the current account balances before the economic crisis in 2008, you could see that compared to other major emerging economies, the gap between imports and exports as a ratio of gross domestic product, the national income, is much bigger than most of the countries. There's an exception of South Africa here. But apart from that, Turkey actually had needs of external capital flows. And it was also, when you look at the capital account regulation indices, whether capital markets were free in Turkey, well, yeah, at the time of the crisis, the regulations were also smaller than most of the emerging economies too. So the institutional structure was supporting the flow of capital. The policy response to that, at first there was a small fiscal stimulus, but then the Turkey recovered. I won't get much into the details of it since it's been a while, but just the point of this is Turkey recovered fastly, partially due to the Erdogan government's increase in government expenditures in 2009. That was a bit late. There wasn't much policy response in 2008, but once it came with public subsidies, tax cuts, cheap credits, the recovery happened in 2009. How shall we continue with this? Do you have any questions or comments, or shall we leave all the questions to the end of the session? Okay. Am I going too fast, too slow?
A bit fast for me.
A bit fast.
Yes,
okay.
please.
Okay. I'll go more piece by piece. Okay. So in the post-2009 period, after the recovery, nothing much changed in terms of the Turkish economy. I mean, what we said about Turkish economy so far is it's very much dependent on speculative financial inflows. It experienced a decline more than other emerging economies. And after the recovery period, similar structure continued. So the Turkish economies continued to be highly dependent on speculative investment capital inflows. And this was supported by low interest policy of four major central banks in the developed world. Fed, Federal Reserve in the US, ECB, European Central Bank, Bank of England, and Bank of Japan. All of them, for recovery, implemented low interest rate policies. And all of them also have a trend of financialization in the sense of companies and moving their activities more from real investments to financial investments. So basically, there was massive money flowing to the investment banks. And yeah, I mean, the investment banks, when they receive the money, and this is what I basically hear from like the comments from the investment bankers, they basically have so much money that they don't know where to spend. And the investments in the developed world didn't bring that high interest rate. So some of the monies flew to emerging markets. And they might be aware that countries like Turkey have fragilities. What they think is, well, let's buy an asset in Turkey, we can sell it in 2 years' time anyways before the crisis comes. So that's kind of the mindset of the investment bankers. Well, so the speculative financial capital flows return back to Turkey. During that, in the post-2009 period, there was also a massive growth in finance and construction sectors, much more than the industry sector and more technology-based sectors. Here, if you look at the graph, the share of GDP, the incomes earned from total income in information, communication, industry sectors, the share of GDP. I renewed this a bit based on the new national account calculations. There is an increase in the share of the industry and information communication industry sectors. It's by like maybe from here by 1 point as a share of GDP. But the construction sector has been growing much more, like by 2 points, although by size it was much smaller than the industry sector. So we can say that there's like a maybe 20–30% rise in construction sector as a share of GDP. And there was an increase in finance and insurance services activities. So there were greater rise in here compared to here. And this was, we'll see it later, the total income in construction is also is supported by the foreign investments coming to the real estate in Turkey too. So I'll show you in a few slides that as opposed to foreign direct investments making investment in, as a form of industrial investments, we'll see that there's a greater increase in foreigners buying real estates in Turkey. Again, the share of imports in Turkey increased from 23 to 28% as a share of GDP. And most of the imports is based on intermediate and capital goods. So it's, when we talk about the rise of imports, we have to think that it's not like luxury goods or consumption goods. It's this because of the structure of industry. We produce, we export, but the amount of value added that we have is not that high. I mean, it's more like a Lego industry, what some call. We produce cars, electronic goods, but all these productions very much dependent on the intermediate goods that we are buying from abroad. And in this period, the current account deficit over GDP stayed still above 5%, which is extremely high. It's much higher than most of the emerging economies, and it peaked at 8.9 in 2011. When we talk about, so this is the similar story basically continues in the post-2009 period. After 2013, the settings started to change a bit because there are these rumors that the Federal Reserve is going to increase the interest rate started. What does that mean? It means that the availability of hot money flows might not be as good as it was if the interest rates increase through the world. Because now there could be like high interest rates in the developed world, so it would be the investment bankers or would be more hesitant to bring their money to Turkey. And of course, that's one thing that started increase the fragility in Turkey. So everybody started to basically follow the decisions of Federal Reserve for a reason in Turkey. And on top of that, there's rising political tensions because of deteriorating democratic rights, and later there's a end of ceasefire in the Kurdish issue that also increased the political tensions. There's a rapidly growing external indebtedness in the latest period. If we look at, for instance, here, so this is the total gross external debt stock as a share of GDP. So these are the levels of 2001. As you can see, it peaked up in 2001 crisis due to the public sector's high indebtedness, which declined during the Erdogan period with the help of the decline in the external debt, with the austerity measures successfully implemented during the Erdogan period. But then, after starting from 2006, there's an increase in the external debt in the private sector. And after 2001, this became more and more visible. And as you can see, if you look at the total, okay, the public external debt in public sector is still not very problematic, but if you look at the overall external debt stock as a share of GDP, it's actually similar to the 2001 crisis level stuff. So there's a massive fragility in terms of that. And the private sector, basically, to be able to pay these debts, they basically demand dollars, which is basically one of the reasons behind the rise in dollar-Turkish exchange rate in the latest years. And so this is one thing we have. And one might say that, well, who cares about the private sector? I mean, some of the companies, one will go into bankruptcy, and that will be it. But this is not usually what it happens. I mean, the more likely scenario is that if we see a flow of private companies that can't pay their debts, probably Turkish government will bail out some of them and take some of the debts to themselves. And as a likely scenario that people started to speak, which people like Korkut Boratov and even like departments in IMF is getting prepared for it, is if a scenario like that happens, Turkey might return back asking money from IMF too at some point. So this is something that's being said out loud lately. Yeah, I mean today more and more, and 2 months ago, for instance, Korkut Boratov has written an article like that, and later we learned that actually IMF formed a small department on the possible case of Turkey, where Turkey will ask money from IMF. So it's dangerous. And the current account deficit is also still a problem. It's increased even further in the first quarter of 2018, which means that we have rising currency needs. And one thing is that we still finance this with hot money flows, but as you can see, in terms of foreign direct investments, excluding real estate purchase of foreigners, there's a decline between 2011 to 2017. And as opposed to that, we see that there's real estate purchases of foreigners. So people basically don't want to invest to Turkey because they don't. They see that the Turkish economy is uncertain, but still the Turkish government is trying to keep the demand with the big projects that they have, which still keeps the real estate purchase of foreigners at high levels. But of course, this is a thing that might not be as stable.
Just one question here. Is that purchase of foreigners, are they foreigners or Turkish foreigners?
Yeah.
There is a tendency that after President asked, lots of German citizen Turks are pouring money into Turkey. That is one of the reasons, I suppose.
That's a good question, but the answer I don't know, honestly. But one thing that I could say, that I don't know the impact of German Turks or the Turks living in Europe, but one thing I could say is the impact of Arab capital is not as big as people think. There is an impact, but that's not the only thing that's pushing for that. There's also European investors that's like buying for the future. But that's a good question too. And another thing that makes Turkish economy currently more fragile is the depleting foreign exchange reserves of Central Bank of the Republic of Turkey. These foreign exchange reserves is of course being kept for emergency situations. Once there's a rise in dollar, once the Turkish lira depreciates, the central bank keeps reserves for selling dollars. But lately there's a significant decline in the foreign exchange reserves of central bank too, which means that the central bank is having like lower and lower bullets to throw. And I'm not saying this here, but this is more like gross reserves, which means that a lot of this money basically belongs to other banks. So in terms of net reserves, it's actually below $30 billion. So less bullets that central bank has. When we add all these up, the greater need to have foreign exchange and greater fragilities, the significant depreciation of Turkish lira is not a big surprise. And here, this is today's data, basically. After elections, the Turkish lira has gone a bit better, but this is depreciation of currency starting from the beginning of the year to today at noon, I guess. As you can see here, the worst case, the biggest depreciation happened in Argentine, in peso, but everybody is now speaking about the Argentinian crisis already. And next is Turkish lira. So, and as you can see, these two are kind of like diverging from the rest of the other economies. People talk about Brazilian real and South African rand too, that's also depreciating, but really the other currencies seem much safer. And this was like 20% before the elections. Now it's a bit recovered with the election results, but this recovery might be temporary too. And as you can see, if we make a little comparison between 2001 and 2007, you could see that the level 17, the levels in terms of gross external debt stock is actually quite similar for the year of Ecevit crisis and current crisis. There's a difference, of course, that the most of this debt is more in the private sector rather than the public sector now, so it's higher for the private sector. And today we have another issue that increases the fragilities in the Turkish economy, which is there's a much bigger household debt. Like credit card debt, credit card, mortgage, it can be like debts that you have to pay your vehicles, automobiles, consumer credits of other types. Which wasn't the case in 90s or 2000s. This is something new, and it basically picked up in the latest 2-3 years. Which of course is a big fragility, because once the economic crisis happens, a lot of these people might not be able to pay their debt. Okay, this has to be GDP, but okay, there is the current account deficit is still at high levels. It's actually higher than the 2000 pre-crisis levels. And in terms of the foreign exchange reserves as a share of central bank as a share of gross external debt, it's high. It's actually low. Sorry. So it used to be high at the in the middle of Erdogan government. It increased up to 30%, so the central bank reserves were quite safe in like 2011, 2012. But now in the latest years it declined, and now it's at the levels that's similar to the economic crisis in 2000. So there are fragilities that are quite similar to 2001 crisis now, unfortunately. So this is the story of the first part. The next part I will talk a bit about how this growth cycles are happening, but how the regular people are being affected, like whether the inequalities increase, if it increase, how did it increase, in what aspect increase. It's these high growth rates that are fragile created jobs. So let's start with whether there's a growth of jobs. First of all, the first thing is that although during the Erdogan government there has been relatively high growth in periods like 2000 to 2006, or between, let's say, 2012, 2011 to 2015, let's say, there were relatively high growth, but these actually didn't create solve the problem of unemployment. Indeed, in the 90s, in the second half of 90s, the unemployment rate in Turkey was around 7%, and during the whole Erdogan period it's higher.
Just real figures.
Yeah.
Statistic.
Yeah, these are the Turk stats. I mean, there might be, of course, they might have played with these data and stuff, but that's another issue. I mean, if they are playing with it. Actually, there is, I didn't mention about that, but for the GDP data that's post-2009, there has been, they renewed the data, and there has been a lot of critique on that, like saying that these data might not be very realistic. It's like matching with some other figures, like electricity consumption, but that's a different issue. I mean, but I have to say that the post 2009 GDP data is not very reliable by many economists. So let's put that aside. And in terms of like unemployment rate, it didn't solve much problem. And in terms of the non-agricultural unemployment rate, still compared to the second half of 90s, it's slightly higher. In terms of the wage shares, which is the share of wage workers as a share of GDP, but this is sort of like we call adjusted wage share. So what is it adjusted for? It's adjusted by counting the share of self-employed declining and people becoming wage workers. So there's an adjustment happening by EU's EMEK statistics, Eurostat's EMEK statistics. Well, we see a trend that the share of wage workers basically declined in GDP, starting during the Erdogan period. So Erdogan period was for a long time favoring the capitalists, the business owners. In the latest years, there has been a small increase, but still the level is higher, lower than the 2002, where Erdogan was elected. So there is sort of like a redistribution, at least according to these figures, from wage workers to capitalists. But of course, keep in mind that that doesn't mean that the overall wages hasn't increased. They have, but it's just, this is just the inequality measure. Okay. So there's a decline in the adjusted wage shares from 57.3% in 2002 to 48.4% in 2006, and there's a decline during the recovery of the Great Recession too, but there's a slight increase between 2013 and 2016. And by 2017, the wage share is still lower, which is still dramatically lower than the 61% in 2000. Nevertheless, the contrasting, the seemingly contrasting thing is that the personal income inequality did not increase. Because the personal income inequality also accounts for the inequalities between the, within the wage workers, or the gaps between the wage workers and the rural peasants or informal sector workers and the formal sectors. So there's an aspect of like the inequalities in the working classes that we have to consider. That also affects the personal income. So if you look at the income inequality measures, this is a typical measure called Gini coefficient, which is the inequality measures that's highly being used. And one is showing full inequality, meaning that there's one, if one Gini coefficient is 1, all income is concentrated on one person and the rest gets 0. And when Gini coefficient is 0, everybody has the same income. And if you're in between, basically, you're in between, like the fully egalitarian and full inegalitarian case. So the decline in Gini coefficient shows decline in inequality, and you see that there's the slight decline in Gini coefficient. Are these figures reliable? Well, they changed the calculation methods in 2016, which partially shows the increase. So there are like methodological issues too. And indeed, only like 60–67% of total income in Turkey can be captured by this. So we can be captured by surveys. So it's actually not a very good figure to detect the top incomes. And indeed, there is a now Piketty, for instance, Thomas Piketty's top income database that has been formed throughout the world, measuring top 1%. That became popular based on the tax data, but unfortunately for Turkey, that's not a very good measure too, probably, because there's a lot of informality. But so this is like one measure we have. That's not perfect. Let's keep that on our mind. But there are some figures that might actually be reason for decline in inequalities. One is there might be a redistribution between the organized blue collar, unionized blue collar, and white collar professional workers versus other people, informal workers. So, and this is something pragmatic, I would say, because you might think that the more like white collar professional, highly educated people are more social democrat, JRP voters, whereas the informal, relatively poor workers or workers that are working for minimum wages are more Erdogan's voters. And we see that there's an increase in minimum wages as compared to the GDP per capita during the Erdogan period. So you see the trend that there's an increase in, there are fluctuations, but compared to GDP per capita, you see that there's an increase in minimum wages. There are, of course, fluctuations. For instance, this happened because of the election campaign. I mean, when Kurdish Party and Social Democrat Party basically put some targets for minimum wages, Erdogan government also had to come out and said, at the time, Ahmet Davutoğlu government, we are also increasing minimum wages to 1,400 liras, which is the reason behind this increase. But overall, the general trend is the poorest workers in the urban sector are actually getting relatively better. There's also a reduction, so there's sort of like a gap between high-skilled and low-skilled working classes. There's also a rising informality that kind of stopped. There's a decline in informal sector, informal employment too, with the economic growth. And this is not something happening in Turkey. When there is an economic growth, the informal employment as a share of agricultural employment declines. I mean, this is something that I also worked for a while. And it, I think, came to its borders now. It kind of stopped in the last 3 years, the decline in informality, but it was happening. So this first green line also includes the rural sector. So it includes the informal employment decline due to migration from rural to urban sector and decline in informal sector within the urban sector starting from 2006. And the blue line basically shows the share of informal employment as a share of total employment in the non-agriculture sector. So the sector excluding non-agriculture, which we also see the decline. So basically, I mean, of course, once we think like this is the presentation, this is like the depeasantation happening, and also like people becoming part of the working class as opposed to being part of like subsistence, self-employed, which of course something that we have to put a question marks in terms of whether people's welfare is increasing, because okay, like you might be owning a grocery store or working in the market that's much more flexible and you might be more free. Now your son might be earning 20% more but working in a supermarket with a boss. Is your conditions getting better or worse is something, of course, that we should put a question mark. But this is, if you look at its impact on inequality, it would reduce inequality because your son would be earning more incomes, of course. In terms of transfers, there's also an increase in the transfer revenues, and this is more like social transfers between 2002 and 2016. So there is kind of a redistribution effect coming from that too, that we have to consider. So in summary, there's a decline in inequality, not due to the increase in wages, but due to the redistribution within working classes and increase in transfers, redistribution of income through transfers. One last statistic in terms of the trends in inequalities in Turkey is the impact of horizontal inequalities. So this is from another work that we have done with Hasan Tekgüç. We basically divided Turkey into four categories. One is Sunni Turk and religious people, which is Erdogan voters. Religious Turkish, Sunni religious, and other people apart from Kurds and Arabs. So mainly Turks that are not religious, but also Alawites is the second group, and also Kurds and Arabs. And when you look, unlike what people think, the gap between religious Turks and the other Turks is not that high. It's like 80%. So the average income of Sunni Turkish religious people as a share of average income in non-religious Turks is just 80%. Okay, it's not that big as people think. The bigger gap is between Kurds and Arabs, I would say. So the share of income of Sunni Turkish religious as a share of average income of Kurds is bigger, and it's similar for Arab population. So if you talk about like ethnic or like how would you say cultural groups and the differences, I'm putting this because there has been arguments about these white Turks, non-religious Turks. I mean that seems to be very elite and compared to the Erdogan voters. It's actually not true, at least for the last years. And this calculations are coming from Conda data, Conda, the polling company. Yeah.
Can you explain this again?
Mm-hmm.
Is this the difference of income between Sunni and Turkish and all the others, including Kurds, which means Turks and Sunni Turks are earning much more than Sunni and Kurd. So there is a national difference.
There's an ethnical difference.
Ethnical high difference.
Yeah, I mean it's like
it's 1.6.
1.6. It's 1.6. So it's like 160%.
Okay.
So it's 60% more on average.
And that green shows that between religious people and not religious people, if they are Turks,
Yeah.
the difference is around 80% and it doesn't increase.
And it doesn't increase.
So there is a, how do you say, clear discrimination due to ethnicity.
There's a clear discrimination due to ethnicity, yes. But having said that, and one thing that you should notice is that this is the peace period, where the difference is declining, as you can see. When this war started, again, in the southeastern Turkey, the inequalities increased. This is also something that we should highlight. But having said that, these numbers might seem big, but when you decompose the source of inequality in Turkey, 95% of inequality is due to the inequalities within groups, so within Turks, within Kurds, and rather than between groups. This might look high to you, but it actually contributes to only 5% of the total inequality, which might be still quite a bit, but again, like the bigger source of inequalities in Turkey is due to like the inequality within the Kurds themselves, or the inequality within the religious Turks themselves.
Just, this is a very important table. I have never seen it before. Can we, for example, say that if we are to comment on the table, then, for example, after 2015, religious Turks don't want to share their riches with the Kurds or Arabs, so they take more control and they, for example, stop doing trade with Kurds just because Kurds were not loyal to the state.
I would say the main reason behind the rise is the conflict in the southeastern Turkey.
Yeah, okay. I understand.
Probably.
Okay.
Because this is a period where the peace ends. Why this gap is not very big? Because what I would say is a lot of the Turkish businessmen are just they're just playing the roles that they have to play. If you look at a lot of conglomerates, they have good connections with government, and government is benefiting from that. I mean, they need capital to do some of their investments, and yeah.
Just so the poorer groups are the Kurds and Arabs in
yes,
ethnic Kurds and
Arabs.
Arabs, but the Sunni and Turkish religious are still poorer than the other mainly non-religious Turks.
Yes.
So I don't understand Turkish society that well. So who would the non-religious Turks be in class terms?
For example.
Yeah, like people like us mostly.
Yeah. Professionals,
Secular.
secular,
westernized.
Secular.
So the richest are the secular, in the middle are the religious Turks, and the poorest are the ethnic Kurds and Arabs. Okay.
Yeah. But the differences is not as big as Erdogan exaggerated, because Erdogan basically came as, I'm the leader of you guys who have been suppressed for all these years, the religious Turks. But having said that, they are not as suppressed as they are taught to be, at least in the last 5 years. We don't have figures about like 2000s, unfortunately, so we don't know how this trend changed. But again, I would be really surprised that if there's a massive increase like that. But this is another discussion. Okay, so I will try to wrap up. Maybe I have like 10 minutes here. So, policy alternatives, okay? What shall we do? The AKP government, Erdogan government, is kind of aware that they have to do something about this current account deficit. So they are like developing some projects. One is domestically made card production. So they basically formed a consortium of 5 national companies. They are going to subsidize those companies, and they are planning those companies to invests by $3 billion to form a Turkish car. There have been like Turkish automobile production made by many companies, of course by Fiat, by Ford, but this is like more like a project for developing a Turkish brand so that the value added might be higher. There's a project that they developed like that. The other is, lately there has been subsidies on chemical, pharmaceutical industry investments, electronic goods, machinery, automobiles and food industry investments. But mainly when we talk about chemical industry and machinery industry, these are intermediate and capital goods. So you have to, we already said that the problem was in the imports of intermediate and capital goods. So Turkish government is doing some mild attempt. I mean, this is like just $100 million of subsidies to break this. However, I think there are three issues on why this industrial policy might fail. One is, if you are thinking about moving towards capital-intensive, technology-based goods, you need to have good human capital. But the trends in Turkey is that the education is going to other way. And just to give an example, for instance, in the Korean industrialization, this is the GDP per capita in Korea and Brazil and Turkey. You see that the Korea, South Korea, of course, is flying at some point. But I'll tell you something more that's more interesting. At the year 1980, the GDP per capita in three countries were more or less the same. And then the Korea flies. And before that, Korea was much poorer. It was an agricultural country. But look at the same year, 2019. So this is when Korea was together, but here, starting from 1950s, Korean education starts to take off. And at the year 1980, where the income levels were more or less the same in three countries, actually Korea had much better education levels. It had much higher average years of school. And this takeoff, many people say, happened because of the land reform that happened in South Korea. So that because of the significant land reform, like the peasants increased up to a level so they could invest on education, which basically led to this significant result. Well, I mean, this can be up to discussion, but just I think it's an interesting figure that we should. What's happening in Turkey in terms of education? In the latest years, especially, there's an increase on the elective course of religion in high schools and middle schools. And the schools focusing on religion education, which we call İmam schools, basically start to give more and more graduates, and their student capacity increase. So this is like a project of Erdogan's Islamization, like increasing the religion classes as opposed to sciences and mathematics classes, and increasing the schools that are giving this education. And this started to become more explicit from 2012. The İmam Hatip middle and high school students increased above like 1 million by 2015. And this is actually exactly the years that Turkey started to do bad in PISA scores that measure the quality of education in Turkey for the 15-year-old, 16-year-old kids. So in 2012, in different fields, Turkey was ranked around around 40s, which in 2015 scores it declined to mid for like 45 to 47. And countries like Romania, Bulgaria, Emirates, Chile that were behind Turkey in 2012 are actually above Turkey in all fields. And people who realize the deterioration of education in the public schools basically start to send their children to private schools. As you can see, the share of students increase in private schools massively. So this is a big problem, I think. So yes, I mean, we need to have better human capital, but the country is going to other direction. And this is not only it. In terms of university education, there's a massive decline. Partially after the firing and threatening of academic people in Turkey, in the latest years, according to Times Higher Education's rankings, 4 Turkish universities in top 200 in the world basically dropped from that, and now we have no universities in top 300. So there's a massive decline in the sciences too. If you look at top 10,000 for Metropolitan Technical University rankings, sorry, 1,000. So there's a decline from 19 to 15, which is, so in terms of, yes, I mean, to develop your technology industry, you need education and better human capital, but we are going towards a different direction. And apart from that, the educated part of the Turkey is flowing out of the country. There's a significant brain drain, which, as Ismail Kahraman, the Speaker of Grand National Assembly, said, we now export brains to the world, which is a funny phrase because he's like saying this as a good thing. But in reality, I speak with people on my own age, academics, different people, skilled workers. They all are moving to Europe, and even if they are not moving, they are making plans of moving. So basically, we need academic freedoms, and we have to prevent brain drain for long-term economic growth. When we are developing industrial policies, I think this has to be supported by planning institutions. If you look at, for instance, the, of course, history of Soviet Union between 40s and 70s, you see that there's a massive increase in industry that wasn't sustainable, but that was pushed by planning. But apart from that, I mean, if you look at the capitalistic cases like Japan and Korea that were like being seen as development miracles, you see that planning agencies, like especially MITI in Japan and in South Korea also, until 1980s, which is a period that they already are developed their industries and now they are free to fly in free markets. The planning agencies play their role. So yes, I think if we are developing an industrial policy, this has to be supported by government bureaucracy. And to have good government bureaucracy, of course, you need good bureaucrats. So you shouldn't have institutions, development institutions that where people based on their connections to Justice and Development Party should come. You should have serious institutions where the best people are working. And of course, if you are talking about supporting industries selectively, and saying to private sector, okay, I'll give you some free credit, cheap credit and subsidies to invest in these sectors. Well, we can do that, but we also should avoid crony capitalism. And for that, of course, you need to have some performance criterions, and of course, like a good justice system that would monitor whether these credits and subsidies are given based on these performance criterions. Unfortunately, in Turkey, the justice system is really bad condition now, and according to this World Justice Project rankings, that in terms of constraints on government of justice system, Turkey is ranked at very bottom. The last one thing is that do we need capital account regulations to prevent hot money flows? This is an issue I think that we might discuss, but it's like walking in the thin ice, because if you bring it immediately, then that ice will be broken. Now we need capital inflows. If we say we are putting capital account regulations, the capital inflow will stop at the point that we really need hot money flows. So we need to do this carefully, even if I think this has to be something that we should consider to prevent these cycles, at least smooth those cycles. But if we are going to bring those capital account regulations, we have to do this at the time of. And last thing, there are solutions that some people say, okay, we have big capital account deficits problem. So let's solve this by getting rid of the unions, cutting the minimum wages, so we would increase our competitiveness in the world. Well, different work basically find that the increase in wage shares, the share of wages, basically have positive effect on economic growth in the short run. There's one work that's finding the vice versa result. But I think more than that, the long run benefits of lower inequalities is a lot. Like it supports education, it reduces corruption, it reduces crime rates, it leads to better institutions. I mean, even in the UK, we see that there's an increase in inequality, and now there's an increase in crime rates, for instance, in London. And this applies to many places that might have worse effects on the productivity. So the dilemma is like whether we want to specialize in goods with lower productivity and lower value added and have some competitiveness through wages, or we keep the wages high and benefits from the productivity effects of this and like try to evolve to the sectors that actually would have higher value added. So as conclusion, I would say the growth is still very dependent on capital financial flows. There's an important risk for sustainability of growth, especially now. For sustainable growth, we have to consider like egalitarian industry restructuring, which might be supported by a combination of industrial and trade policies and planning institutions with more elite bureaucracy. And we also need to promote education, scientific education and freedom on the academic world to support the growth of technology-based sectors in the long run. And also, I would say, improvements in the justice system. The rule of law in Turkey is quite crucial for the long-term sustainable growth. Thank you.
Things are changing daily in Turkey.
Yeah.
Yesterday there was a news about no tax on 1,882, and another news again just heard before coming here. Another 4.8% reducing deficit in the reserve of the central bank. Mm-hmm. It was less than 80 million dollars now. Mm-hmm. And meanwhile, we are talking about justice and everything. Another member of parliament in prison today, Social Democrat Party. And so, in my opinion, Turkey entered a kind of tunnel. There is no light. We need to work very hard. People need to work very hard to find light to get out from this tunnel before collapse.
From what you have told, what would be your opinion if there is a crisis coming? Mm-hmm. What sort of a crisis will it be? How could it end up? Mm-hmm. Now, before, we know that when the crisis was coming, there was coup d'etat, usually, right after. Mm-hmm. But now, the state is one whole. Mm-hmm. There is no conflict within the state structure now. The civilian head, army, and everybody is in the same boat. Mm-hmm. They are together. So what could happen if there is an economic crisis with the economic picture you have given us?
Okay, I'll comment to two of them. First of all these are policy conclusions, or of course I'm looking from a very naive perspective, I have to say, because we will have 5 years of Erdogan government, and in terms of education, justice, I don't think that the trends will be reversed. I would be very happy that, or academic freedoms, education, I would be very happy to see that they would be, but if you ask my opinion, things will go worse in terms of those goals. and I think they're not very capable of like changing the problems we have. That's one thing. In terms of your question, the scenario I have is the following. Probably for a while there will be return of capital flows for a couple of months due to the elections and due to the expectation of financial markets that there will be some sort of stability happening. But that trend, I don't think it will last very long because we still have high current account deficit that will support the growth of external debt. And well, if you ask my opinion, I think there will be a big economic crisis in Turkey based on the indebtedness in the private sector, and the government will have to bail the private companies and will have to go to IMF to support those bailouts. How long would that last? That's hard to predict, because first of all, Turkish economy has a structure so far to recover fast, I think. So by the time that we come to the period of the next elections, Turkish economy might be in another boom. That's a possibility. The other thing is, I think the Turkish economy also might be affected through the changes in the international trends too, because now everybody thinks that the Federal Reserve will increase the interest rates, but I don't know how much that will continue, because there's a boom in United States too, which might reverse that trend. So now the US economy is doing fine, so the Federal Reserve is confident on rising the interest rates, but how long will that boom in the US last is a question mark. Another question mark is, of course, this mercantilist policies, the world moving towards a more closed economy direction with the push of Donald Trump. What will be the effect of this in the long run to Turkey is another question. In terms of the political effects of a possible crisis, what I would say is that whenever there's an economic problem in Turkey, it was always in the expense of Erdogan's popularity. We saw this in the local municipality elections that happened after the 2008-9 crisis. We saw that in the 2015 June elections too. So I think an economic crisis would reduce Erdogan's popularity, but again, it's hard to predict the impact of this on the political environment, because at the current situation, it's hard to renew the elections. So, I mean, Erdogan got the majority with the Nationalist Party, and even if the Nationalist Party, MHP, repeals their support on Erdogan, the current system doesn't allow to renew the elections until there's a 60% majority in the parliament. So it seems like we have to have Erdogan for a while, unless something really radical happens in Turkey, or Erdogan dies.
Any questions?
You go first.
But what do you think about, in general, the recovery within the capitalist system? Because we are always thinking about the decline, and despite that there's mini recoveries, boost and boom, and etc. But don't you think that it's a long run? We are in the declining period, and this is affecting, and the recovery was through neoliberal economy, and the neoliberal economy introduced a lot of measures which was very severe in terms of employment, etc. Basically, what you explained, I mean, within the ongoing economy makes sense, but at the same time, on macroeconomic level, I have many questions actually. Inequality is not growing, as I can understand, as we imagined or said in rigorous forms.
Let me say something. I mean, I think Turkey from 1990s, from the beginning of 1990s, is basically flowing with the wind over here and there. So the global trends are, with the current system, is quite effective on where the direction of where Turkish economy will go. I would say, for instance, I mean, a lot of people blame for Ecevit government for the 2001 crisis, but if you look at the history in 1990, I mean, there was a crisis in 1998 in Brazil, there was a crisis in Argentina in 2000, there was a crisis in East Asia in 1997, 1998, and also in Russia. So with the current system, with the current neoliberal structure, there wasn't much, Turkey wasn't very much diverging from other countries. And when there was a boost in the world, it didn't diverge from the other countries again. What would happen? I mean, like, as I said, when there's a crisis, there will be a recovery. But what's going to happen in like 2020s is a question mark, of course, because it's dependent on many factors, and it's not only dependent on the factors in Turkey. It's very much dependent on how the Europe and U.S. economy will go. I feel like now the neoliberal regime is kind of experiencing severe problems in the developed world, especially in the US and Europe specifically, and also in Japan too. And this decline in the growth rates in these countries was a chance for the periphery. So once the center was declining, the periphery was having good periods because of the reasons that I was explaining.
Like China.
China is a different story because China is very much, it's not a liberal economy as much as us or Latin American economy. It's not a socialist country in the classic sense. There has been changes, of course, starting from late 1970s and mainly from 1992. But it's still highly regulated economy in terms of capital flows, in terms of goods trade. So it's a different story, but I would say Turkey is always like more similar to Latin American countries, or countries like Thailand, for instance, South Africa, those countries.
Boom and bust. Whenever boom in Turkey, there is the bust for it. But each bust bigger than the previous one. That's why if you compare the debts and economical situation with 1980s or 10 or 70s, Turkish debts are almost $500 billion. And again, they are expecting inflation 14.5 this month. And it's a kind of cycle. First, currency goes up, then interest goes up. When inflation goes up, the Turkish lira loses its value, and again currency goes up. And following interest, this type of cycle going on and on in Turkey. I think this time the bust will be very dangerous, very dangerous. Also, because of this situation, and any kind of democracy in Turkey is they lose this. They have to tie down. They will forget about democracy or anything, and they already started. sort of measures to stop the opposition, any kind of opposition. And things are getting worse and worse in Turkey. This time must be very much higher than 1982.
I want to ask a domestic question and maybe the international context of Turkey. Domestically, Turkey was identified as one of the most significant emerging countries, like with the mint assignation. It's the T in mint. So you said Turkey's more like is more like Latin America and Thailand than it is like China or an East Asian economy. So I wonder, as a fairly ignorant person, whether you could explain the extent to which the growth, albeit speculative, which Turkey sees in the boom periods is leading to a growth of industry. I mean, is Turkey basically industrializing in the same way as the East Asian economies might have done, or is the neoliberal privatization and all of that has led to the kind of deindustrialization you've typically seen in the United States and Britain and all of that, with the growth of services and all that means? And what's happening in agriculture? Because you said there seems to be a growth. There does actually seem to be a proletarianization of the population happening, but at the same time, the adjusted share of wages is falling. Where is the share of national income that's not going to wages? That's going to profits, I presume, or something like that, or and if so, what proportion of those profits are being reinvested? What's the level? One stat I did not see was the level of investment in the economy. Perhaps I missed that. But China famously has incredibly high levels of investment in the economy. Is there anything to indicate that Turkey is taking the same direction as that?
Okay. Let me start with this comment. In terms of the bust in here, the 2001 and 1994 busts were also really bad in terms of economic bust. So we don't know whether if there will be a crisis, it will be worse or better than that. But all of them were bad. The decline in democracy is another issue. How much the economic crisis, a possible economic crisis, will boost that is something we don't know which direction to go. That I would say. Some people say, yeah, it might lead to like it might create an opportunity, say, for even further authoritarianization. But I mean, the trends are already too bad. So if I think if there is a boom period, it might also create good opportunity for greater authoritarianization. I mean, because when people earn money, they're fine. They don't care much about academics going to prison. In terms of your questions, let me put it this way: Turkey has slightly greater. I mean, the trends are similar to Latin America, I would say, but I think Turkey has a bit more. Overall, Asian countries, I would say, have greater growth potential than Latin America, on average, because the inequality in the countries that didn't experience very tragic history of colonization did not have that high inequalities as much as some sub-Saharan African or Latin American countries, which I think is keeping the potential growth rates in this country. And this is not something that's in Erdogan period, that's in every period. And if you look, for instance, here, as you can see, the growth rates in Turkey were higher than middle-income countries in 90s too. And it's a similar trends in here. That's one thing that I would say. But having said that, when Turkey was seen as a star-ring country in the first period of Erdogan, it was similar situation for other countries too, like Brazil, for instance, right? People were saying, oh, Lula's policies were great, and Brazil was also one of the stars too. So we actually introduced the BRIC countries, specifically because those countries were experiencing high growth rates at the period. In terms of industrial restructuring, we have to say that, first of all, Turkey has been a country that's moving from a rural society to urban society, so from agriculture to non-agriculture sectors. So there's an increase in the share of all non-agricultural industries. In terms of the technology base, so first of all, like we have to think that there isn't like deindustrialization yet, at least. But having said that, the increase in some of the services sector, like construction, for instance, and finances, is bigger than the increases in industry in terms of proportions. Like for instance, this has increased its shares by like maybe 15%, whereas you could see that construction sector maybe like almost doubled in terms of its share in GDP.
It's still added together, it's not even half of what the industrial thing is it?
There are other sectors in here, like there's trade. I mean there's like other services sectors, like government services. So the supermarkets are not here, put it that way, or the hotels or the transportation. I mean, you just taken 3 sectors. So in terms of the structure of industry, let me put it this way. It would be a bit unfair to say that there was zero structural change within industry in a positive direction. I checked the complexity rankings of Turkey too, in terms of the products that they export and how much complex they are, whether I mean, what we mean by complexity is if you are moving from textiles, for instance, to, let's say, high-tech chemical or pharmaceutical sectors, your complexity ranks increase. Turkey's complexity rank is getting better. There is a change, structural change at Erdogan period, from low-quality products to high-quality products. We cannot avoid that. But having said that, the industrial restructuring hasn't yet solved our problem of current economic deficit. We still export more, but still this trap we have is still there, which when we are exporting stuff, we have to import or intermediate and capital goods to have growth. In terms of the adjusted wage share that you were talking, and agriculture sector, let me just explain this graph better maybe. This doesn't entirely show the wages over GDP. This adjustment is basically adjustment considering that there's a move from self-employment to wage workers. So what it does, it attributes a value to the income earned by self-employed, and also includes that as a part of total wages and divides that number. Okay, so it's not it kind of accounts for the decline on self-employment here, I would say, with the methodology they have. Of course, in an economy like Turkey, which is not a mature economy, it's harder to come out with wage share measures because there's a proletarization, as you said, mentioned. But in terms of agriculture, what Erdogan government has done is, when they first came to the power, they cut some subsidies in some selected products, which pushed for the proletarization. At the time of 2009 crisis, we mentioned this a bit in the article too. There was sort of like a depeasantation period due to the declining subsidies, and there was rising poverty in the rural sector between 2009 and 2011. And now currently I think the proletarization period is coming to its limits, in the sense that the agricultural population, I have to check the figures again, but it's around 15% at most. And in terms of the informality, which is a part of the self-employment, it reached to now 20% in non-agricultural sector, and the decline stopped. And as you can see, in total informal employment, including agricultural sector, the share also stopped too. So I think this might be, the informal employment share might be a good measure of proletarization, which is obviously observed during the Erdogan period, but it's coming to its limits.
Would you describe what's left, what's not shown there, as the proletariat, if you like? Is it wage workers? You've got to go from 50+% to under 40% of informal employment.
Mm-hmm.
It's 60% wage labour now, would you say? Or is it less?
Yeah. I mean, it's not entirely wage labor, but people working in formal sector, in the sense, and how do we measure this? By registering to social security institutions. But of course, these highly match. I mean, people who are self-employed are more likely to be, apart from skilled self-employed jobs, informal, and people who are of course it doesn't one-to-one match, but when we look at the self-employment figures, and we see similar trends too. I mean, there's a similar decline in the self-employment figures too. Yeah.
Could you come back to the page where you have been talking about the Turkish car project?
Mm-hmm.
Now, I also know some information about this Turkish car production.
Mm-hmm.
It is mainly electrical and autonomous vehicles,
Mm-hmm.
because the other sector, the other area is already overcrowded.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the problem with this is this. Now, in order to have electrical or autonomous, even electrical, and furthermore autonomous cars, you have to have a very, very big infrastructure investment, which makes immediately this project hot air. Actually, it is hot air, because when it is talk about electrical cars, even in London, we have problems to find places where you can charge electrical cars. London is a huge city. Maybe you may say, okay, it is Istanbul, but we have problems there, where you have to have infrastructure for electrical cars. I'm not talking about autonomous cars at all. It is a joke, because in Europe, even in America, they have problems with the infrastructure. That is not enough for autonomous cars. Okay, concerning this automotive sector, why it is important? I think automotive sector is admiralship of the Turkish industry. According to some reports, more than 18% of all exports are from automotive industry, which is single-handedly the biggest one. Now, there are problems there, because the main industry companies are like Toyota, Ford, Fiat, Renault, and so on and so on. They have foreign, how do you say, main companies. But the support industry, which should be the Turkish industry, they say that the industry sources say that the nativeness or domesticness of the production is 35%, which means 65% at least of any car, any vehicle must come from abroad. And they are talking about the values. When they start talking about the quality, the chips, the screens and so on, that percentage goes even down. The main problem of Turkish capitalism there is that the investment to R&D is very low and they can't do it. They don't have resources to do it. And so what happens is that when everybody starts talking about Industry 4.0 in the mainly automotive industry, Turkish industry is just, how do you say, held by hands. They can't do it. When you cannot do it, you miss the train. Next train, where does it go? I don't know. But it seems they have also missed the train in automotive sector. Because there is a talk about Iranians and the other countries, Thailand and so on and so on. So they are losing the chances. Now, there is also, if you believe newspaper Dünya, Turkish capital is investing en masse in North Rhine-Westphalia in Germany. They say that they are investing there.
For what?
Turkish.
Yeah, but for which industry?
I don't know the details, but the investment board in North Rhine-Westphalia tells that Turks are opening shops here from Turkey. And we also know recently that lots of Turkish big capitalists are moving to England, for example, London, the big capital. And we also know that the Turkish capital investment, foreign investment in the other countries is on the increase as well. They are investing in Egypt, they are investing in Belgium, they are going there as well. So how do you comment on these developments?
Okay, let me just start with the last comment. This is you're right. There's a trend like that, like big capitalists like Doge, Ülker. It seems like they are moving some of their capital abroad, and this might be because there are so many political uncertainties in Turkey. They might not be seeing what will happen in terms of the economic situation, but also in terms of political situation, because there's one person that decides on everything, and who knows what he is going to decide in the next 5 years. So that's one thing, I think, why a lot of the Turkish capitalists are moving their capital abroad. In terms of the domestically made cars, I'm talking about elite planning institutions because of this. Because domestically made car production might have some good intentions, but honestly, there are a couple of questions that we have to answer. Why we are trying to invest on car production, first of all? Why is it not, for instance, something else? Pharmaceutical production? Or why is it not software? Why is it specifically car production that Turkey is willing to put so much money? That's one question. I don't think that's something that's being deeply taught. The other is, as you said, what sort of car is going to be produced? Is it going to be electrical car, autonomous car? Do we really have sources to produce these? If it's electrical car, which one would make sense? Because it seems like when the first project came out, everyone has no idea about these questions. So apparently this is a project that an idea just came out, the funding is being created, and the decisions will be made on the way. Which isn't the best approach to develop an industrial strategy. That's why I was like talking about like having longer term plans. And this also includes what you said, the infrastructure investments. Okay, if we, for instance, are going to produce electrical cars, is there sufficient infrastructure to sell these cars? Or is there, even for like projects like Third Airport, the big project of Erdogan, right, in Istanbul, which is a really massive project. It's one of the biggest projects in the emerging world. It's actually the biggest project in the emerging world that's lately being made. I mean, they're doing this, but what will be the return of that is a question mark. There should be an underground going to that because the airport is in the middle of nowhere. When it's going to be built is a question mark. I'm not even talking about the environmental ecological issues, which is a huge concern. So all these like plans are being done like just randomly, which I find a bit problematic. And in terms of, for instance, domestically made car production, another thing that I would be very concerned is that why are we having a consortium of 5 companies rather than 5 different companies that will be competing with each other? For instance, why we create a monopoly like that would be subsidized by the government? That's a question. If there will be a consortium like that, you will have a bureaucratic structure, then why the state itself is not investing? I mean, what's the benefit of private sector? There will be competition, right? But you're creating some sort of, I mean, I assume that this consortium is going to be supported by some tax cuts or also for the car to survive after this. So all these like issues are, I feel like, question mark, which I feel the project will not be as successful as it's being taught. And just another comment. Do you know what these are? These were the first version of domestically produced cars. And you know what? These cars, I mean, they first like created a project like that led by the Turkish Science Association, TÜBİTAK, and they spent some money on R&D, but the money was definitely insufficient. Like it was like $50 million, which seems a lot, but it's really not a lot for developing a car. And the whole project failed basically. I mean, they produced, like these are like prototypes taken from another company, and they basically throw this money out, and now they're with a bigger project. I mean, this domestically made car project has been there for a while. It just failed for the first 3-4 years.
All dictators launched a big project, enormous project to affect people's mind. Canal Istanbul. Do you know Canal Istanbul project in Turkey?
I don't know.
Just a canal, think about, parallel to Bosphorus, from Black Sea to Marmara.
Okay.
Unbelievable. So billions will go there. Like a nuclear central. Nuclear station. Yeah, nuclear stations. What will bring Turkey? Earthquake. They don't care about it.
One last question. Can we, for example, think of another model for Turkish economy? It seems to me that Turkish economy and the politics fit suitably to a model of imperialist country. Finance capital has established. They have their commodity exports up to $150 billion, and they have their financial investments. They are investing around 100 countries now, they say. I don't believe that. There is a research going on in Sabancı University about the Turkish foreign investment. you can't reach it from Sabancı University, but you can reach from the American partners. But there is already quite a lot of imperialist attitude from Turkish side, and what you call the tendency to invade the other countries. You don't need any proofs. Look at the Turkish problems with the Greece. Look at what has happened in Cyprus in 1974, and look at Syria now. They are just, how do you say, sickling when they look at the petrol in Raqqa, and they are talking about relations with Kurds. So Turkish economy is in need of imperialist expansion, but the big brothers don't let it do it. So what do you think about such a model application?
Well, Turkey wants to play this imperialist state role, but apparently it's not economically, politically, and in terms of like its military resources, it doesn't have the power to be one of the big imperialist states. And so all these projects apparently of like bringing, making Syria a small satellite of Turkey, for instance, failed badly, and Turkey basically is paying for this for a while. Well, I mean, we are not that strong to be imperialists in the sense of, I mean, we can take some imperialist roles, but there's always like bigger brothers that would prevent us to play these roles. That's what. And okay, I mean, now Erdogan is trying to supposedly take a position against US, NATO, or at least seemingly taking, but again they have to buy the planes lately from US. I mean, if they don't buy the planes from US, then they have to buy the planes from Russia. So you basically are dependent on another imperialist. So yeah, I mean that's more like a nationalist propaganda that's not going somewhere so far, I would say. That's one thing. In terms of another economic structure, I mean, my imagination, of course, I'm also influenced by more like Marxist tendencies to. Yeah, I mean, I would be, and when I read the more like history of developing countries and the currently developed countries, there's always like greater state intervention, the state and like a visible hand role to break these vicious cycles that we have, that developing countries have been having. So I would go for greater state intervention planning and also more egalitarian regimes. Can we have a socialist regime? I don't know. I mean, it's a big question. We haven't seen, unfortunately, a sustainable one, except Cuba, socialist regime so far. What would be a socialist regime or successful socialist regime in today's world is a big question. But we can, if we really want to have like an egalitarian world, and if we are aware of the problems of capitalism, neoliberal regime, we have to think about solutions with cooperatives, with greater state-owned enterprises, where there's more democratic structures so that it wouldn't collapse, and more planning agencies that would push for policies in these structures. So I would be, of course, I would be for alternative regimes in that sense.
I wanted to ask about the international stance of Turkey. Ishmael's covered quite a lot of that. One thing I'm interested in is Africa and FDI going into Africa, and Turkey is often mentioned as one of the new sources of investment in Africa, and Erdogan did a visit, has toured Africa, hasn't he? He's visited Africa on occasion. And Brazil is another of the emerging countries alongside China, of course, which is the biggest. So I wonder whether you have any information or thoughts on that. And also Turkey's relationship with the EU, which is quite pertinent now, given that Britain's relationship with the EU is up in the air. Is because Turkey is still formally in the state of applying to join the EU. What do you think will happen to that application over the next five years? What's the indications as far as that's concerned?
Let's start with Africa. At the time of Erdogan period, of course, Africa is it's a poorer continent, so it's by size smaller markets. But the trade, the exports towards Africa, has increased during the Erdogan period, and that might be partially due to the networks of Fethullah Gülen too. I would say all these schools might have effects, but also not only that, like the Turkish state with Ahmet Davutoğlu, for instance, had like this policy of forming like new consulates in Africa. So there has been an increase in with African trade. In terms of FTIs, what the current things that I've been reading lately is Turkey is trying to use. So Turkey is having a problem of like increasing food prices, and they're looking for alternatives to reduce that. And this is of course going to be happening in the expense of peasants in Turkey. But now the first concern is like satisfying the urban poor population, I would say. So they have plans of moving some of their production in terms of agricultural production to countries like Somalia, Sudan. Especially Sudan is quite popular lately, I would say. And Turkey has been buying massive land to do cheap agriculture over there. So in terms of FDI, we see agricultural production moving to Africa. Turkey is using Africa for that. At least they have intention plans of that. The impact of that, of course, it will be negative for current account deficits and the Turkish peasantry, but it would help us to reduce the food prices, I would say. In terms of EU membership, well, if you ask me, Turkey's relationships with EU, I think it didn't go anywhere, not because of Erdogan. It's partially because of the rising nationalism in the EU too. So there's both sides that prevented Turkey's EU membership. And if you look at when the EU candidacy negotiations stopped, it's very much related to Sarkozy getting elected in France and Merkel getting elected in Germany. Because the social democrats in these two countries are relatively sympathetic to Turkey. England has always been supportive of the EU, more supportive at least, EU membership of Turkey. But also with the collapse of neoliberalism in the EU, people are looking for scapegoats, so there's rising nationalism, there's rising racism, so it's getting harder for countries to accept like 80 million population country to admit to EU and to give like free right to travel around the EU. So that's one problem. Of course, the democratic rights going backwards in Turkey, the collapse of justice system, and all these like declining standards in terms of the matching standards in EU, of course, helps to stimulate all this process, but there's a two-side process. I mean, in terms of how long the EU membership will continue, or membership candidacy will continue, that's a question. I guess the play that EU is playing here is that if Turkey's EU candidacy entirely drops, EU will not have any upper hand on Turkey. I mean, they might comment on the Turkish politics, but that would be much more insignificant since there's no card like Turkey's EU candidacy is there. And if you look at Turkey's perspective, Turkey still needs to attract capital inflows. Say the capitalists are still, in terms of economics conditions, Turkey is still good. EU candidacy is still a card. So Turkey doesn't want to drop that entirely either. So, but this doesn't mean that this weird situation will last forever. There's also other conflicts. There's also other interests of EU countries of this, like migration. Unfortunately, Syrian immigrant cases. I mean, there's Germany wants Turkey to keep the Syrian immigrants themselves. So there's a deal between Germany and Turkey too, which kind of like keeps the contact between EU and Turkey. We can say a similar story for the US and Turkey too. I mean, US and Turkey relationships have been damaged lately, but again, similar situation. I mean, Turkey doesn't want to be out of NATO because where will Turkey go if we are out of NATO? Second, again, like the economic concerns are basically playing role. And probably US doesn't want to kick Turkey out of NATO because they want to have an upper hand on Turkey and sell armories products still to Turkey. So it seems like it might go like this in this thin ice, but which might be broken at some point.
Any last words?
I guess that's it. I hope we will have a bright future.
Yeah, we have
which we'll see. I mean, in Turkey, last words is the end of tunnel seems quite dark now, but Turkey is a very unstable country in terms of everything. So one day something unexpected could happen, and all the political context can change also, as it happened in Gezi and it happened in other cases.
we have a huge raw material in Turkey. In 5 years, we are all exporting them, the imams, our source.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.